She knelt beside a man who hadn't spoken a kind word to anyone in 3 years, and she prayed for him anyway. He was supposed to be asleep. He wasn't. And the words she whispered in that frozen Wyoming night changed something in him that no one else had touched in a decade. If you've ever loved someone who believed they didn't deserve it, this story is for you. Stay with us. And if this kind of tale speaks to your heart, subscribe and follow along because we're just getting started. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon, and by the time Caleb Whitaker dragged himself through Abigail Mercer's door, the temperature had dropped hard enough to split fence posts. He didn't knock. His right hand was too swollen to make a fist. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stood there in the frame, snow caking his coat, one boot leaving a dark red smear on the threshold that wasn't mud. Abigail was at the stove when she heard the latch. She turned, and for 1/2 second she didn't move because the man filling her doorway looked less like a person asking for help and more like a man who had already decided he didn't deserve any. "Mr. Whitaker." Her voice was steady. "You're bleeding, I'm aware. Come in, I won't impose. You're already imposing. Come in before you fall on my porch and I have to drag you." He came in. He had been working the Hendricks grazing lease 3 miles north, pushing the last of the autumn cattle through the canyon pass before the snows locked it. The other hands had made it through clean. Caleb had not. His horse had spooked at a rock slide, not a bad slide, the kind that barely registers. Just a dozen stones loosing from the upper shelf, and the horse had pitched sideways and taken him down into a shallow ravine. He'd walked out, 3 miles in weather that made a man's ears go white. He sat in the chair nearest the door because it was closest, and because he would not go farther into her house than necessary. Abigail set a cloth in a bowl of water and brought it across the room without asking permission and without any ceremony about it. She knelt beside the chair and took his hand and looked at the gash along his palm. A rock edge had caught him when he'd caught himself, and she didn't flinch. "This needs cleaning, I know that too." "Then stop gripping the armrest and let me do it." He released the armrest. He watched the ceiling instead of her hands, because watching her hands was not something he was prepared to manage. Outside, the storm hit the side of the cabin with a sound like a flat hand slapping timber. "You can't ride back in this," Abigail said. "I'll wait it out. The pass will be drifted by morning, then I'll go around." She looked up at him. She had that particular quality that some women carry, the kind that makes a man feel seen without feeling accused. He didn't like it. He liked things he understood, and he did not understand her at all. "There is a room off the back," she said. "It has a bed and a stove. You'll stay there until the storm breaks and your hand is fit to grip reins, Mrs. Mercer. That is not a conversation we're having tonight. Mr. Whitaker, eat something first, then sleep. Everything else can be settled in the morning." He ate what she put in front of him, salt pork and biscuits and black coffee, and he did not taste much of any of it because his hand had begun to throb in earnest now that it was clean and the cold was leaving his body. He'd had worse. A broken collarbone at 19, a mule kick to the knee at 26 that had kept him limping for a month. Pain was not the issue. Pain was familiar. It was the sitting still, inside, with another person nearby, that made him want to push back from the table. He'd been on the Mercer land for 6 weeks. He'd taken the hired hand position in September when the Hendricks lease needed someone to manage the fence line on the south quarter, and the south quarter ran along the Mercer boundary. Old habit had made him introduce himself to the neighboring property owner when he arrived. He had not expected the property owner to be a woman on her own, 28 years old, with a small herd and a leaking roof, and the kind of quiet competence that made a man feel slightly ashamed of whatever he'd assumed before knocking. Her husband had died. He knew that much. He didn't know the particulars and had not asked. In his experience, a widow who didn't offer the story didn't want to be asked to tell it. He had repaired her fence line twice, once because it bordered the Hendricks land, and it was practical, and once because it was the right thing to do, and he was not going to examine that further. She had thanked him each time without making it larger than it was, which he appreciated. Most people made things larger than they were. The coffee was better than anything he'd had at camp in 6 weeks. He didn't say so, but he drank 2 cups. The back room was small and cold until Abigail built the stove. And then it was small and warm, and Caleb lay on top of the quilts in his shirt and trousers, because he would not make himself more comfortable than that. He stared at the ceiling. The storm pressed against the single window. The wood in the stove ticked and settled. He did not sleep. His hand made sure of that. The throb had become specific, a tight, regular pulse that climbed his wrist every time his heartbeat did, and he lay with his arm flat on the mattress and breathed and waited for the storm to peak and begin to ease. He heard her moving in the main room, the soft sound of boots on plank floor, the low creak of the rocking chair near the main stove. Then quiet. He did not wonder what she was doing. That was a lie. He did wonder, but he was practiced at not acting on the things he wondered. So he closed his eyes and set his jaw and worked on being still. He was very nearly there, that shallow edge between wakefulness and something close to sleep, when he heard her voice. Not loud, not a voice meant to carry. A voice meant for somewhere small and private that had no walls. She was praying. He had heard people pray in churches, where prayer was performance, and the real audience was the congregation. In his mother's kitchen, where grace before meals was habit so old it had lost its meaning. Even in the bunkhouse once, where a young hand named Archer had gotten quietly drunk on payday and started talking to the ceiling in a way that was half prayer and half argument. This was different. Abigail Mercer prayed the way some people breathe, like she didn't know she was doing it. Like it cost her nothing and meant everything. He couldn't make out words at first. Just the rhythm of them. Then the storm eased a degree, and her voice carried a little more clearly, and he heard. And Lord, the man in the back room. I don't know his whole story, but I know enough of it. Please remind him that losing someone doesn't mean he was meant to carry it alone forever. Please let him understand that a person can live past their grief if they just don't close the door all the way. Caleb stopped breathing. He lay completely still, one hand flat on the mattress, and he did not move for a long time. He was not a man given to being blindsided. He had trained himself, after years of practice, to see most things coming, to read the room before he walked into it, to understand what people wanted before they asked. It was a survival skill. It kept him useful and it kept him separate, which was how he preferred things. No one had prayed for him in a very long time. His mother, maybe at the end, after the accident. He hadn't been home to know for certain, the accident. That was what he called it in his head, the accident. As though putting clean edges on it made it something he could set down. His brother had been 22 years old. His name had been Thomas. He had been fast and loud and reckless in the particular way of young men who believe they are permanent. And Caleb had spent the whole of Thomas's life trying to stand between him and whatever was coming next. Until the day he wasn't fast enough. The cattle had spooked a real spook, not a rock slide. A lightning strike 40 yards upslope, and Thomas had been on the wrong side of the herd, and Caleb had been 60 feet away, and he had ridden as hard as he'd ever ridden, and it had not been enough. Not by 20 feet and maybe 4 seconds. He had carried Thomas out of that canyon himself. He had not gone home again after the funeral. He had moved west, and he had worked, and he had kept moving because stillness was the thing that let it catch up with him. And he had been very careful in the years since, not to let anyone close enough to be the next person he failed to save. And now this woman, this widow he'd known 6 weeks, this woman who had cleaned his hand without asking permission and fed him biscuits without making him feel obligated, was kneeling in her sitting room in the dark, praying to God on his behalf. He pressed his eyes shut. Her voice continued lower now, and he could not make out the words anymore, and that was probably for the best. He'd already heard enough to make sleep impossible for a different reason than pain. He lay there for a long time. He thought about Thomas. He thought about the way Thomas used to laugh too loud. Always, in the way that made other people laugh whether they intended to or not. He thought about the last conversation they'd had, which had been an argument about a horse Thomas wanted to buy that Caleb thought was too young and too green, and Thomas had called him an old woman about it, and they'd both laughed, and then the drive had started, and they had not finished the conversation. He thought about Abigail Mercer's hands, working a cloth over his palm, with the same matter-of-fact gentleness she brought to everything. Apparently, no fuss, no theater, just the thing that needed doing. Done. He thought about what she had said. Losing someone, doesn't mean he was meant to carry it alone forever. He wondered who had told her that, or whether she had worked it out herself, or whether she knew from her own grief, the husband, she didn't speak about what it cost to believe it. He did not sleep for a very long time when he did. Finally, he dreamed of Thomas laughing about something that didn't matter. And in the dream he laughed too, and when he woke in the gray light of morning, he lay still for a moment with the thinking of it on him, before it dissolved the way dreams do. The storm had passed in the night. The window showed white sky, pale and flat, and the silence outside had the specific quality that means deep snow. He sat up, his hand had stiffened, he flexed it carefully. Testing. The gash had closed. Abigail had used a thin strip of linen, and the swelling had gone down enough that he could make a partial fist. He'd done harder work with worse. He could hear her in the main room. The stove. The sound of the coffee pot. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his boots on the floor and thought about what a man was supposed to do with the knowledge that someone had prayed for him. He didn't know the answer. He was not by nature a man who received things gracefully. But he knew one thing. He had heard something last night that was not meant for him. And it had landed somewhere it was not supposed to land. And he could not unlearn it. He pulled his boots on. He stood up. He walked out into the main room. Abigail was at the stove with her back to him, moving efficiently in the quiet way she always moved, and she did not startle when she heard his boots on the floor, which told him she was not a woman who startled easily. "Coffee's ready," she said without turning. He sat down at the table. She brought the pot and poured and set a plate in front of him, eggs this time, and the last of the biscuits from the night before, and she sat across from him with her own cup and looked out the window at the snow. "About 2 feet," she said. "Maybe more in the drifts. I can see the woodpile from here." "You're low. I have enough." "You don't. Not if another storm comes in the next 2 weeks." "Which it will." She looked at him, not surprised by the directness. "Just measuring something. I was planning to bring more in this week. I'll split it before I leave." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite read, careful and considering, and something underneath that which he was not going to examine. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker." He looked back down at his plate. He ate. The coffee was just as good as the night before, which meant it was not an accident. They ate in the kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable that happens between people who have been through something together. Even something small, even something as ordinary as a storm and a wound and a few hours of difficult sleep. He was not accustomed to that particular quality of silence. Most silences with other people felt like waiting. This one did not. He did not know what to do with that either. "Your hand," she said, when the plates were done. "It's better. Let me look at it before you go outside." He held it out without arguing. She unwrapped the linen and looked at the cut, pursed her mouth slightly, which was not disapproval but assessment, and rewrapped it tighter. "Don't get it wet splitting wood." "I wasn't planning to. You'll need to change the wrapping tonight." "I'll manage." "Do you have clean linen at the camp?" He didn't answer immediately, because the answer was probably not the kind the camp cook maintained. "I'll bring some with you," she said, as though the pause had told her everything she needed to know, which it had. He went outside. The snow was deep and clean, and the air had the clarity that comes after a hard storm, the kind that makes everything look sharp-edged and new. He found the axe in the lean-to beside the barn and started on the woodpile. The work was straightforward, and his right hand complained about the grip, and he ignored it the way he ignored most things. She came out twice while he worked. Once to check on the 2 milk cows in the barn. He could hear her talking to them from inside. Low and matter-of-fact, the same tone she used for most things. Once to bring him a cup of coffee, which she handed to him, and then returned inside without comment. He split wood for 2 hours. The pile he left her was enough for 3 weeks, which was more than he'd intended when he started. But the work had fallen into a rhythm, and the rhythm had made him careless with time. When he finally set the axe down and looked up, she was standing in the doorway. "You didn't have to do all of that," she said. "I know. But thank you." He carried the last armload inside and stacked it by the stove and picked up his coat from the chair by the door. "Mrs. Mercer," she was across the room. She turned. "I sleep light," he said. "Always have." He watched her face. He watched the particular moment when she understood what he was telling her, not the words, but what he was admitting to underneath them. Her expression didn't change dramatically. She was not a woman who wore her reactions on the surface. But something shifted very slightly in her eyes. "I see," she said after a moment. "I'm not asking anything," he said. "I just wanted you to know." She nodded once, slow. "I know what you're not asking." He held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than was strictly necessary. And then he put on his coat and went out into the snow. He did not look back at the cabin, but he thought about her the entire 3 miles back to camp, not the way a man thinks about a woman when he wants something, but the way he thinks about a thing that has already changed him, and he's still working out how far the change goes. He had not told anyone about Thomas in years. She had prayed for him without knowing the details, and had landed on the thing that was most true, the thing he had spent 9 years refusing to say out loud. Losing someone doesn't mean he was meant to carry it alone forever. He had not asked for those words, he had heard them anyway. And the part of him that had been waiting without knowing, it was waiting for exactly that particular sentence, had gone very still inside his chest and had not moved since. He didn't know what that meant yet. But he was, for the first time in a long time, asking the question, and the part of him that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting for exactly that particular sentence had gone very still inside his chest, and had not moved since, even 3 days later, even with wind cutting through the canvas walls of the camp bunkhouse, and the other hands talking too loud about nothing that mattered. He went back to work the next morning. The Hendricks lease had fence line that needed walking after the storm posts knocked sideways by drifts. Wire pulled loose where the snow had weighted it and then settled wrong. It was the kind of work a man could do alone and think too much during. And Caleb was trying, with limited success, not to think too much. He lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning he rode the south boundary without planning to, and found himself at the Mercer fence line. And the second post from the creek crossing was leaning at a 30-degree angle that it had not been leaning at before the storm. He fixed it. He had wire and a driver in his saddlebag, because he always rode with wire and a driver. It was not an excuse to be here. It was just a fact about how he packed his tools. And the fact happened to be useful. He was driving the last staple when he heard the barn door. Abigail came out with a bucket and stopped when she saw him at the fence line. And she did not look surprised exactly. She looked like a woman recalibrating something she had already half expected. Mr. Whitaker post was down. He nodded toward it. "Storm got the anchor. I saw it yesterday. I was going to get to it this week. It's done now." She set the bucket down and walked over to the fence and looked at the post, and then at the repair, and then at him. And the examining quality of that look was something he had already learned to hold still for. "Your hand," she said. He held it up. He had changed the wrapping himself, which she had apparently told him to do, because she expected he wouldn't. "You used the linen you told me to. I didn't think you'd listen." "I listen," he said. "I just don't always do what I'm told." Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the shape a smile makes before a person decides to allow it. "Come have coffee," she said, "before you ride back." He tied the horse and went in. The cabin was warm in the particular way of a space that is lived in properly, not overheated. Just maintained, tended to. She had a way of making things function at exactly the level they should. No more and no less. He had noticed that in the barn too. The 2 times he'd seen it. Nothing wasteful. Nothing neglected. He sat at the table. She brought the coffee and sat across from him, and wrapped both hands around her own cup the way she always did. And for a moment neither of them spoke. "How long have you been working this territory?" she asked. 6-7 years. Came up from Colorado before that." He looked at his coffee. "Kansas. Then a while in Missouri. You move a lot." It was not a question. She had a way of making observations that didn't demand anything. She put them down on the table like objects and let him decide whether to pick them up. "Work moves," he said. "I follow it. That's one way to look at it." He looked at her. "What's another way?" She met his eyes without flinching. "That a person can always find work if they look hard enough. The question is whether they're following work or avoiding something else." The silence after that was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight. "You're not shy about saying what you think," he said. "I used to be. I got over it." What changed? James died. She said it plainly. The way you say something you have made peace with, even when the peace is hard won. When you lose someone you love, you stop wasting time on not saying the true thing. He was quiet. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I'm sorry about your husband. Thank you. She let a moment pass. I'm sorry about your brother. The cup stopped turning. He looked up at her very slowly. She held his gaze without apology or retreat. And he understood in that moment that she had known before the prayer. Or at the very least, she had known enough, and she had chosen to pray for him anyway. Which was a different kind of thing than praying for a stranger. Who told you, he said, not a question, a recalibration. Walt Hendricks mentioned it when I asked about the new hired hand. He said you were reliable and kept to yourself, and that you'd lost your brother some years back in a cattle accident and hadn't been the same since. She paused. I don't think he meant it as a warning. I think he just wanted me to understand you. Caleb set the cup down very carefully on the table. And did you understand me? No, she said. Not from that. But I started to. He should have left then. He knew that. In the clear-eyed way a man knows the right thing when he's about to do the opposite of it. He should have finished the coffee and thanked her and ridden back to the Hendricks camp and put this woman and her cabin and her prayers and her particular quality of directness firmly on the other side of his professional boundary. He stayed another hour. They talked about practical things. Mostly. The South herd, she had 11 cattle, 2 milk cows, and a horse that was developing a problem with its left foreleg she wasn't sure about. He asked the right questions, and she answered them exactly. Without exaggeration, which he respected. He told her what he thought it was, a soft tissue strain, probably from the uneven going after the snow, and what to do about it, and she listened and didn't argue and didn't ask him to repeat himself. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door. Mr. Whitaker, she said as he put on his coat. He waited. I didn't pray for you because I pitied you. She said it quietly, but with the steadiness she brought to everything. I want you to understand that. He held that for a second. Why did you then? Because you fixed my fence line when you didn't have to. And you ate my biscuits without complaint even when you clearly wanted to leave. And because she stopped, she seemed to decide something. Because there are people in this world who carry things they were never meant to carry alone. And when I see one, I pray. That's all. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe for a moment longer than he should have. That's not a small thing, he said. What you just said. No, she agreed. It isn't. He left, and this time he did look back. The cabin sat square and solid against the white landscape. Smoke rising straight from the chimney in air that had gone still. And she was still standing in the doorway watching him go. Not waving, just watching. And he turned his horse north and rode, and did not try to stop thinking about her, because he had already lost that particular argument with himself. He came back 2 days later. He told himself it was the horse's foreleg he wanted to check whether his assessment had been right. That was a functional reason. That was a reason a professional man had for returning to a neighboring property. The horse was doing better. She had done exactly what he'd said. And it had helped, and she reported this without triumph, just information. Plainly given. He stayed 3 hours. He repaired the hinge on the barn door that had been rubbing wrong since before the storm. She noticed him looking at it when he came in to check the horse and said nothing. And he found a piece of strap iron in the lean-to and fixed it while she worked in the barn beside him. Not talking, just moving through her own tasks with the efficiency he had come to expect from her. When she handed him coffee at midday, he was sitting on an overturned crate in the barn. And she sat on a hay bale across from him, and the horse shifted in its stall and blew softly. And Caleb looked around at the barn, clean, organized. Everything in its place, and said without intending to, You run this whole operation yourself. I do. No help from anyone in town? Something changed in her face. Not much. She controlled her expressions well, but enough. The town has opinions about a woman running a ranch alone, she said. They're generous with those. Less generous with the other kind of help. What kind of opinions? That I should sell and go back east, where I have family. Her voice was even. That James was the real manager, and I only think I know what I'm doing. That a widow running cattle is not the right picture. She looked at the horse. The man who owns the feed store in Garrison shortchanges my orders. Not a lot. Just enough that I know it's deliberate. He did it the first time in September, and I counted the bags and went back and told him. And he apologized so smoothly I almost believed he meant it. Then he did it again in October. Caleb felt something tighten in his jaw. His name? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. She looked at him. The steadiness in her eyes was still there, but underneath it now was something more careful, a woman deciding how much to trust. And how fast, she said. Owen Hargett. Caleb nodded once and filed it. I manage, she said. I always find out and I always go back and make it right. But at cost time I don't have. And it costs, she paused. It costs something else too. Something harder to name. Your patience with people. She looked at him sharply. Like he'd said something she hadn't expected to hear articulated out loud. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. He finished the coffee and stood up and said he'd be back in 2 days to check the foreleg again. And she said that was fine, and neither of them made more of it than that. Which was the right way to handle it, and he rode back to camp, feeling like a man walking a line he was not sure he was supposed to be on. He came back in 2 days, and 2 days after that. And then it was no longer about the horse. The horse had healed. They both knew it. She did not mention it, and neither did he. And on the morning of the 3rd week, when he rode up, and she came out of the cabin with 2 cups of coffee before he'd even dismounted, he understood that they had silently agreed to stop, pretending there was another reason. He drank his coffee standing in the yard with his horse behind him, and she stood on the porch step with hers, and they talked about the weather, real weather. The kind that affected cattle and fence lines, not polite weather, and then about the south herd, and whether she should sell 2 steers before January or hold them. And he gave her his honest analysis because she asked for it directly and did not want to be managed. Hold them, he said. Prices drop in January when everyone else sells before the hard freeze. Wait until March. I'll need to feed them through. You have enough hay? Barely. I'll bring a load from the Hendricks stores. Hendricks won't miss it. He's got 3 times what he needs, and he told me to use my judgment on the surplus. She looked at him. The careful, measuring look. You don't have to do that, I know. She held the look a moment longer and then looked away. Across the yard, and he saw her jaw set in a particular way, not against him, but against whatever it cost her to accept help from anyone. All right, she said quietly. Thank you. He nodded and finished the coffee and handed the cup back, and their fingers touched on the handle just for a second. Just the brief overlap of hands around a tin cup, and neither of them commented on it, and neither of them moved apart faster than was natural. And that was perhaps the most significant thing that had happened since the night of the storm. The hay arrived the next afternoon. He drove the wagon himself rather than sending one of the hands, because he did not want to answer questions about where it was going, and because he wanted to stack it himself, which he did in the barn while she worked on the other side of the wall sorting harness. And they called back and forth through the partition about nothing particular. He asked whether she thought the weather would hold, and she said she doubted it, and he agreed, and it was ordinary, in the way that things become when 2 people have passed through the careful stage and into something less guarded. Something that has not been named yet and maybe shouldn't be. He was on the last load when he heard a horse in the yard. He heard Abigail's footsteps stop. Then a man's voice, louder than necessary, Mrs. Mercer. Glad I caught you. Caleb set the hay down and stood still. Mr. Hargett. Her voice was perfectly controlled. I wasn't expecting you, riding past, thought I'd stop in. Neighborly. A pause. Saw the wagon. You got hired help now? I have someone working the fence line. Hendricks, man? Yes. The sound of a man looking around in the way that is not really looking but assessing. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about your November order. I think there may have been a discrepancy again. Caleb walked out of the barn. Owen Hargett was a wide man, built like someone who had been heavier once, and carried the memory of it in his posture. He was on horseback, which gave him height, and he had placed the horse at an angle that required Abigail to look up at him, which was not an accident. He looked at Caleb with the practiced neutrality of a man who has sized someone up and doesn't want them to know it. This is Mr. Whitaker, Abigail said. He's been working the south fence for Mr. Hendricks. Whitaker, man to man. The kind of nod that is also a measurement. Didn't know Hendricks had anyone new on. I've been on 6 weeks, Caleb said. Long stretch. Good land. A pause. Hargett looked back at Abigail. About that order, Mrs. Mercer. You may want to come down to the store tomorrow, and we can sort it out. I'm sure it's just a counting error. It's always a counting error, Abigail said. The pleasantness in her voice was real but thin like ice in early spring. Hargett smiled. It did not reach his eyes. These things happen. No offense meant, and yet they keep happening to my orders specifically. The smile held. I'll make sure it's right next time. I would appreciate that. Hargett looked at Caleb again, a longer look this time. The kind that is trying to work out whether a person is a problem. Caleb looked back at him with the particular expressions he had learned over years of being in situations where a man needed to communicate something without saying it. That he was paying attention, that he had already formed an opinion, and that the opinion was not favorable. Hargett gathered his reins. Nice operation you've got here, Mrs. Mercer. Be ashamed not to see it prosper. He touched the brim of his hat. Whitaker. He rode out. Abigail stood in the yard and watched him go, and the control in her posture was total, and it cost her something to maintain it. And Caleb stood 6 feet to her left and waited until the sound of hooves had faded. How long has he been doing that, he said. Since October. Maybe before. She turned back toward the barn. He's on the town council. He knows people I need to do business with. He knows I know that. He's trying to make you sell. She stopped walking. Turned to look at him. He's tried to buy this land twice. James refused him both times. After James died, he waited about 60 days before he came to me with an offer. She paused. He was very polite about it. Caleb felt the thing in his jaw tighten again. Harder this time. What did you tell him? I told him that James built this ranch and I intended to run it, and that I was not interested in selling at any price. She said it without drama. Just the fact of it. He smiled the same way he just did and said he understood and left. And then my feed orders started coming up short. Caleb looked out toward the road where Hargett had gone. He won't stop at feed orders. No, she said. I don't believe he will. She walked back into the barn and picked up the harness she'd been sorting. And he watched her hands move over the leather checking, fixing, putting things right, and something settled in him that he had no clean name for. It was not pity. She had told him she didn't want that, and she was right not to want it. It was not protectiveness exactly, though that was part of it. It was the thing that happens when you see someone doing something hard and doing it right, and you find that you cannot walk away from that. He picked up the last of the hay and finished stacking it. When he was done, she came around the partition and looked at the stack and then at him. I need to know, he said before she could speak. When he comes back and he will do you want me here? She looked at him for a long, careful moment. You work for Hendricks. Hendricks doesn't govern what I do on my own time. It's a lot to ask. You didn't ask. I offered. Another moment. The barn was warm with the smell of hay and horses and wood smoke drifting in from the cabin. And she was standing very still, the way she did when she was working something out. Yes, she said, if it comes to it, I'd want you here. He nodded. Then I'll be around. He left before dark and he rode back to camp in the settling cold. And he thought about Owen Hargett's smile and the way Abigail's jaw had set while she watched him ride away. He thought about the feed orders, short by just enough. Just enough to be deniable. Just enough to wear a person down without giving them anything clear to fight. He had seen that kind of pressure before. It was the kind that worked slowly and worked best on people who were alone. He was not going to let it work on her. He didn't ask himself why. The asking why stage was behind him now. Somewhere on the road, between the first fence post and the barn door hinge, and a cup of coffee handed across a porch step with fingers touching on the handle. He unsaddled the horse and brushed him down and went into the bunkhouse and ate and did not talk to anyone, which was not unusual enough to remark on. The other hands had long since stopped trying to pull him into conversation. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He thought about what she'd said. Because there are people in this world who carry things they were never meant to carry alone. And when I see one, I pray. He had spent 9 years making sure no one could see what he carried. She had seen it in 6 weeks. He wasn't angry about that. He had examined the feeling carefully over the last 10 days. The way you press a bruise to understand how deep it goes. And it was not anger. It was something closer to the feeling of a window being opened in a room that has been sealed for a long time, the first cold, clean air moving through. Uncomfortable and necessary at once. He was not ready to name what was happening. But he was, for the first time, no longer trying to stop it. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind was picking up again from the northwest, the slow build that meant weather in 18 to 24 hours, and he lay there listening to it, and thinking about 11 cattle and a south herd. And a woman who prayed for people she barely knew. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, he fell asleep without noticing. Which was the first time in 9 years that sleep had arrived without him having to chase it down. He woke before dawn with a thought already formed. Clear and complete, waiting for him, the way thoughts sometimes do when the sleeping mind has worked something out ahead of the waking one. He was going to find out what Owen Hargett's real plan was. Not for himself, he had no stake in Garrison's town politics. He was a hired hand on a seasonal lease, and there was no professional reason in the world for him to involve himself in a land dispute between a feed store owner and a widow rancher. None of that changed anything. He got up in the gray pre-dawn and dressed and went outside to check the sky. And the sky confirmed what the wind had said, snow by afternoon. He had time. He rode into Garrison before the town was fully awake. Which was intentional. The feed store was not open yet. But the livery was, and the man who ran the livery was named Corcoran, and had been in the territory since before the railroad. And men like Corcoran knew everything that happened in a 30-mile radius, because they were where people stopped when they arrived, and where they waited when they needed to go. Caleb went in for grain he needed it, or near enough, and while Corcoran measured it out, he said, casually, that he'd heard Hargett was looking to expand his land holdings on the south side. Corcoran didn't stop measuring, but his mouth moved. Hargett's been after the Mercer quarter section for 2 years. Was after it when James was alive. James told him to walk it, and he didn't like that. Corcoran tied the sack off. Now James is gone, he figures the whittle'll fold eventually. He's a patient man. Patient or strategic? Corcoran looked at him then. You working for Hendricks? Yes. Hendricks' land borders Mercer to the north, it does. Corcoran's eyes were old and very clear. Hargett gets the Mercer parcel, he's got water rights on the South Creek, and a quarter section that boxes in Hendricks's south grazing access. Hendricks has been too busy to notice, or too comfortable to care. Caleb paid for the grain and loaded it and rode back out of town and sat on his horse at the edge of the road for a moment, working through what Corcoran had just handed him. It was not about the widow. It had never been only about the widow. Hargett wanted the land because of what it did to everything around it. The Mercer parcel was the key that locked the South Water and controlled the access to 3 neighboring leases. If Hargett held it, he held leverage over every rancher in the south quarter of the valley, including Hendricks, who was Caleb's employer and who was Corcoran, was right too comfortable to have worked this out. Abigail Mercer was not just a widow being pressured by a bully. She was the single piece on a board that several men were maneuvering around. And she was sitting in the middle of it running her 11 cattle and her 2 milk cows without knowing the full shape of what was converging on her land. He rode back to Hendricks. He found Martin Hendricks at the breakfast table and said, directly, that there was something he needed to explain about the south boundary situation. And Hendricks, a man who was not stupid, just occupied, put down his fork and listened. Caleb laid it out. The feed store, the short orders. The 2 previous offers on the Mercer land, the water rights on the South Creek, and what they meant for Hendricks's grazing access if the land changed hands. Hendricks was quiet for a long time when he finished. How do you know about the water rights? I walked the creek line when I was doing the fence survey. And Corcoran at the livery knows everything. Hendricks drummed his fingers on the table. Hargett's on the town council, I know. He's got friends on the water board, I figured. Hendricks looked at him. What do you think she should do? I think she should know what she's in the middle of, Caleb said. She's running her land well. She deserves to know the whole picture. A pause. You've been spending time over there. It was not an accusation. But it was not nothing. I've been keeping an eye on the south fence, Caleb said. And yes, Hendricks nodded slowly. She's a capable woman. She is all right. Hendricks picked up his fork. What do you need from me? Caleb told him. And Hendricks. to his credit, listened to all of it. The snow came in by noon, lighter than the last storm but steady, and Caleb rode south in it with a purpose he hadn't had in a long time, not the purpose of work, which was always present, but the purpose of a man who has decided that a thing matters and is done pretending otherwise. He arrived at the Mercer cabin as she was bringing the cattle in. She saw him coming across the field and stopped and waited. And when he dismounted and came through the gate, she read his face the way she read most things quick. Without fuss, and said, "What did you find out?" He looked at her. Snow was falling between them, soft and even. "I need to tell you something about your land," he said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." She held his gaze. The steadiness was there, as it always was, but underneath it, he could see the thing she kept most carefully, the part that was afraid. Not of him, but of what he might be about to confirm. "All right," she said. "Come inside." And he followed her in. And the door closed behind them, and outside the snow kept falling on the Mercer quarter section, and the South Creek, and all the land that 3 men wanted, and 1 woman intended to keep. And inside, at the small table with the good coffee and the straight-backed chair, Caleb Whitaker told Abigail Mercer the whole truth. And inside, at the small table with the good coffee and the straight-backed chair, Caleb Whitaker told Abigail Mercer the whole truth, all of it. From Corcoran's grain room, to the water rights on the South Creek, to the 3 men who had been circling her land, like wolves, working out which side of the fence was weakest. She did not interrupt him once. He had expected questions. She was not a woman who received information passively, but she sat with both hands around her cup and listened with the particular stillness she brought to things that cost her something. And he watched her face and saw the moment when the picture became complete for her, when the individual pieces she had already known separately locked together into the shape they made when you saw them all at once. Her jaw set, her eyes went very flat. "The creek," she said. "Yes. James fought for those water rights for 3 years before the territory recognized them." She put the cup down. "He knew. He told me once that whoever held the South Creek held the whole valley's south quarter. I thought he was being—" She stopped. "I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't, no." She looked at the table. He rarely did. Caleb waited. There was more coming, he could feel it. The way you feel a change in pressure before weather arrives. "Hargett came to the funeral," she said. "He brought food. He shook my hand and told me James was a fine man and that if I ever needed anything at all, I should come to him." Her voice was perfectly level. "I thanked him. I was very gracious about it. I didn't know then that he'd been trying to buy James out for 2 years. You know now, I know now." She looked up at him. "How long do I have before he moves beyond feed orders?" "Yes." He considered it honestly. "He's patient. He'll try to exhaust you. First keep the pressure slow. Let the isolation do the work. He knows you're alone out here. He's banking on winter wearing you down." He paused. "But if he finds out Hendricks knows about the water rights, he may accelerate. And Hendricks, you told him this morning?" "I did. He's not going to let Hargett box in his south access without a fight. That gives you a neighbor who has a reason to back your position." Something moved in her face. Not gratitude exactly, it was more complicated than gratitude. "You did that before you told me," she said. He met her eyes. "I wanted to have something to bring you besides a problem." She was quiet for a moment. The snow pressed against the window in soft gusts. "You could have just left this alone," she said. "It's not your land. Not your fight." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his coffee, and then at her hands on the table still, controlled, and then at her face, which was watching him with the particular attention of someone who actually wants to understand, and not just hear an answer. "No," he said, "I couldn't." 3 words. She received them without pushing on them, which was the right thing to do, and which told him she understood exactly what they meant. She stood up and went to the window and looked out at the snow falling on her land. And he watched her from the table, the straight set of her shoulders, the way she held herself when she was working something out, and thought about what it cost a person to build something in this country. On their own, with no backup and no margin, and people like Owen Hargett, watching for the moment you blinked. "I need to go to the land office," she said. "I need to see exactly what the water rights documentation says. James handled all of that, and I've read it, but I need to read it again with this in mind. I'll take you." She turned. Caleb. It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them remarked on it, but it landed in the room and stayed there. I can drive myself, she said. I've been driving myself into Garrison since September. I know you can. He stood up. I'm offering because Hargett has friends on the town council, and the land office clerk is one of them. And having someone beside you who Hargett has already assessed and is not sure about is better than going alone. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. You think like a man who's dealt with this kind of situation before. I've worked for men who use their position to press people, he said. I know how they calculate. And how do they calculate? They calculate who's watching, he said. You walk into that land office alone. You're a widow with a question. You walk in with someone Hargett doesn't have a file on. Someone he can't predict. Someone who looks like he has reasons of his own for being there. The calculation changes. She considered him. Then she went to get her coat. They drove into Garrison the next morning. Early in the wagon, with the snow from the previous day packed hard on the road, and the air cold enough to make conversation brief and purposeful. She sat beside him on the bench with 3 inches of space between them, and her hands folded in her lap, and he drove, and they talked about the South herd, and the hay supply, and the state of the road. And none of it was what they were actually talking about. And both of them knew that. The Garrison land office smelled like dust and old paper, and the particular anxiety of official things. The clerk was a thin man named Aldrich. The clerk looked up when they came in and looked at Caleb and then at Abigail and then back at Caleb with the expression of a man who was rearranging something. Mrs. Mercer. Professionally pleasant. What can I do for you? I'd like to review the water rights filing on the Mercer South parcel. The original documentation, of course. A pause. That may take a few minutes to locate. I'll wait. She stood at the counter with her hands folded and her back straight, and Caleb stood slightly behind her, and to the left, not crowding her, not making it his errand, but present in the way that changes a room. And Aldrich disappeared into the back, and they heard drawers opening, and the particular sound of a man who is deciding something while pretending to look for something. He came back in 4 minutes. I'm afraid the original filing is with the Territorial Review Board. Periodically they Mr. Aldrich. Abigail's voice was calm and very precise. I filed those water rights with this office in 1882. James Mercer filed them, and I watched him do it, and I have the receipt. They are not with any review board. Please look again. A beat of silence. Aldrich looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with absolutely nothing on his face. Aldrich went back into the room. This time he was gone 8 minutes. When he returned, he had a folder. Found them. My apologies. Abigail took the folder and read it at the counter. Slowly, every line, and Caleb watched Aldrich, and Aldrich watched the wall, and the clock ticked, and outside the street sounds of Garrison moved past the window. Normal and indifferent. When she finished, she handed the folder back. Thank you, Mr. Aldrich. I'd like a copy of the boundary description on page 3. He made the copy without argument. She took it and folded it into her coat, and they walked out. On the street she stopped and drew a breath of cold air and let it out slowly. They're intact, she said. The rights are exactly what James filed. The boundary description is specific enough that any challenge would need to be filed through the territorial court. Not the county board. Hargett's not going to like the territorial court. Too visible. No, she started walking toward the wagon. He's going to hate it. He was about to follow her when a voice came from the direction of the hardware store. Across the street. Whitaker, he turned. The man coming across the street was not Owen Hargett. He was younger, mid-40s, lean and weathered, with the look of a man who had spent his life working for other people and knew how to read a situation. He was wearing a coat Caleb had seen before, many years before. In a different state, on a different man. His name was Roy Garrett. And Caleb had not seen him in 7 years, and the last time he had, it had been at Thomas's funeral. His stomach went cold. Abigail had stopped walking. She was watching him. Garrett crossed the street and stopped 6 feet away and looked at him with an expression that was complex relief and caution and the particular discomfort of a man who is about to say something that needed saying for a long time. I heard you were working this territory, Garrett said. Heard Hendricks had a new man. Figured it might be you. He paused. You look like hell warmed over if you don't mind me saying, Roy. He kept his voice even. What are you doing in Wyoming? Moved up 2 years ago. Got a small stake near Fletcher's Creek. Garrett's eyes moved briefly to Abigail and back. Didn't mean to interrupt. You're not interrupting. Abigail spoke before Caleb could deflect. I'm Mrs. Mercer. I ranch the south parcel above the creek road. Roy Garrett. Ma'am. Garrett touched his hat. I knew Caleb's family. His brother, too. The cold in Caleb's stomach spread. Garrett looked back at him. I think about Thomas still. I think about that summer, he said it quietly, without theater. I've wanted to say something to you for a while. That it wasn't Roy. Caleb's voice came out sharper than he intended. Garrett stopped. Abigail looked at Caleb. Her expression was careful. And she was doing the thing she did, reading underneath the surface without pressing, and he could feel her reading it now. The locked quality in his posture, the particular tension that came up when Thomas's name arrived unexpectedly. It's all right, she said, not to either of them specifically, but to the space between them which needed it. Garrett looked at her. Something in her tone had settled him. I only wanted to say, Garrett continued, more slowly now, that I was there that day, Caleb. Not at the moment, but close enough. And there is not one man who worked that drive who believed it was your fault. Not one. We all knew the terrain. We all knew the weather was wrong. Thomas knew too. He paused. He would not want you to be carrying it the way you've been carrying it. The street was quiet around them. Caleb stood very still. He had heard variations of this before, well-meaning people who thought absolution was something you could hand a person like a folded piece of paper, and they would simply take it and be lighter. He had learned to receive those attempts politely and put them away without opening them, because opening them cost more than they delivered. This was different. Garrett had been there. Garrett had watched Thomas grow up the same as Caleb had worked the same drives, had sat at the same fires. When Garrett said there is not one man who believed it was your fault, he was not offering comfort. He was reporting a fact. I need to hear that, Caleb said finally. The words came out rough, like something that had been stored in a place that was too tight. I know, Garrett nodded. That's why I crossed the street. They stood there a moment longer. Then Garrett touched his hat to Abigail again and told Caleb he was at Fletcher's Creek if ever one come by, and walked back across the street and through the hardware store door. And the ordinary sounds of the street returned, and it was just the two of them again on the cold sidewalk. Abigail did not say anything. She waited. That was the thing about her. She waited when a person needed a minute, and she didn't fill the minute with herself. He looked at the hardware store door for a moment, and then down at the packed snow on the street, and then at nothing in particular, and he felt the thing in his chest that had gone rigid when Garrett said Thomas's name slowly, very slowly, begin to release, not all the way, not with one conversation on a cold street, but an increment. The way a knot loosens when you work it from the right angle. He was 22, Caleb said. He hadn't planned to say anything. It came out on its own. The cattle spooked. Lightning. I was 60 feet away. I rode as hard as I've ever ridden, and it wasn't enough. Abigail was quiet. I've told myself every version of that day, he said. Every angle. Everything I should have done different. Faster. Earlier. If I'd positioned him differently before the drive started. If I'd read the weather better. He stopped. I know, she said softly. I know that kind of accounting. He looked at her. When James left for his last deployment, she said, we argued the morning before, about something that didn't matter. I can't even fully remember what it was now, and for a long time I kept going back to that morning, thinking that the last real thing between us was something small and stupid, and I could have made it different. She paused. But that's not how love works. It's not one morning. It's not one argument. It's everything, the whole of it. And you can't reduce a person to the worst hour. He was looking at her fully now, and she was looking back at him, and the cold air moved between them, and it didn't feel cold. You should have told me sooner, he said, that you knew about Thomas. Would you have stayed if I had? He thought about it honestly. No, he said, probably not. That's why I didn't. She said it without apology. I prayed instead. It seemed like the less intrusive option. Something moved in him that was so far from what he had felt for most of the last 9 years that he almost didn't have a name for it. It was close to being known. It was close to being allowed to be known. Those were not the same thing, but they were closer to each other than he had let himself get in a long time. "We should get back," he said. "Storm's turning." "Yes." They walked to the wagon, and he helped her up, not because she needed it, but because the moment asked for it, and neither of them stepped back from it, and he climbed up and took the reins, and they drove out of Garrison, in the gathering gray of mid-morning, with the copy of the water rights documentation folded in her coat pocket. They were a mile out of town when she said, "Why did you really go to Corcoran's?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I told you, I needed to understand what Hargett was. You could have asked Hendricks directly. You didn't need Corcoran." She wasn't accusing him. She was doing the thing she always did, pressing gently on the place where the true thing was. "You went to Corcoran because you'd already decided something before you knew the full picture. And you wanted the full picture to justify what you'd already decided." The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Maybe," he said. "What had you already decided?" He let a moment pass. "That I wasn't going to let Hargett win." She was quiet for a few seconds. "Because of the land, partly, and the other part?" He looked at her. She was watching him with those clear, direct eyes, and the wagon moved under them on the packed snow road. And there was no reasonable way to be indirect about this. Not anymore, not after Roy Garrett and Thomas, and the water rights and the morning, and all the accumulated weight of the last month, pressing toward this particular moment on this particular road. "Because it's you," he said. "You specifically. And I'm not going to talk around that anymore." She held his gaze for a long, quiet second. "All right," she said, not breathless, not overcome, just receiving it. The way she received most things. Cleanly and without unnecessary theater. He turned back to the road. They were half a mile from the Mercer turnoff when they saw the smoke. It was the wrong color and the wrong volume, not the thin white thread of a banked stove, but a thick gray column, rising from the direction of the barn. Abigail saw it at the same moment he did. She made one short, involuntary sound and then went completely silent. And he felt her grip the wagon bench beside him, and he slapped the reins hard. The horses surged. By the time they came through the gate, the hay he had brought her, the load that was supposed to last 3 weeks, was fully involved. The barn doors were closed. The cattle were pressing against the near pasture fence, panicked, and the 2 milk cows were making sounds that carried across the yard, clear and desperate in the cold air. He had the horses pulled up and was off the wagon before it stopped fully rolling. "The cattle," he said over his shoulder. "Get them away from the fence." The far gate go. She was already moving. He went to the barn doors. The latch was down, not the way it latched when you left in a hurry, but the way it latched when someone put it down deliberately. He felt that register, and he filed it, and he lifted the latch and pulled the doors wide, and the smoke hit him like a fist. The hay was stacked against the back wall, and the fire had started there, which was not where a fire started from a tipped lantern or a stove problem. It had started in the back corner, which was where the hay was densest, and where a deliberate fire would start if a person knew what they were doing. He worked fast. There was a water barrel at the near wall full, because she kept everything full, and he thought briefly that her discipline had just saved her barn, and he grabbed a bucket and worked the fire from the edges in. The way you worked a grass fire, isolating it, denying it fuel, not trying to kill it from the center where it was already too large. He went back for water twice, 3 times, 4 times, and each time the smoke was thicker, and each time the heat pressed harder against him, and each time he thought about the deliberate latch and the back corner and Owen Hargett's smile. On the 5th trip he heard her behind him. "I got them out." Her voice was controlled. She was standing at the door with a wet blanket, and she came in without being asked and started beating the edges down on the near side. They worked together, and they did not speak, because there was nothing to say, and no air to waste saying it. And after another 15 minutes the fire was down to char and smoke, and the barn was damaged but standing. And the hay was gone, but the structure was intact. He stood in the burned-out center of what had been the hay store, and looked at the pattern of the char. Back corner, dense, low to the ground, which meant it had been set at ground level. Not from a falling lantern. A falling lantern would have burned from above. Abigail was standing beside him. "Someone set this," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, Hargett." or someone working for him. He was in town this morning when we were there. He looked at the char. But Hargett doesn't do things himself. He hires them done. She was breathing carefully. The way a person breathes when they are keeping something very large, very contained. My hay, she said. 3 weeks of winter supply. I'll get you more. Caleb Hendricks has surplus. I told you that. He turned to face her. I'll get you more hay. That's not the problem. She looked at him. The careful control in her face was real, but it was working hard. And underneath it, he could see the thing that it was containing, not fear exactly, but the recognition that this had escalated beyond what she'd expected, beyond feed orders and careful pressure, into something with fire and deliberate hands and a latched door. He knows I went to the land office, she said. That Aldrich. She said it flatly. Aldrich told him. Or someone at the office told someone. She pressed her lips together. He's telling me it doesn't matter what's in the documentation. He's telling me that he can make this hard enough that the legal standing doesn't matter. He's wrong about that. Is he? Her voice cracked slightly. The first crack he had heard in it, and it was over fast. But it was there he burned my winter hay supply. Caleb. He did it while I was in town, legally reviewing documents that prove my rights. And he did it without leaving a single mark that ties it to him. That's not a man who's worried about the law. No, Caleb said. It isn't. So what do we do? He looked at the char and the smoke and the ruined hay, and then at the intact walls and the intact roof and the cattle safe in the far pasture. And he thought about Hargett calculating, and Hargett patient, and Hargett waiting for a woman alone to fold. He thought about what Roy Garrett had said that morning on the cold street in Garrison. Thomas would not want you to be carrying it the way you've been carrying it. He thought about Abigail's voice in the dark, asking a God he wasn't sure he believed in to remind a man that losing someone didn't mean he was meant to be alone. He thought about 9 years of moving and not stopping and not letting anyone close enough to be the next person he failed to save. And he looked at her ash in her hair, jaw set, eyes direct, standing in the middle of her burned barn without flinching, and he thought, this is not a woman you protect by leaving. We go to Hendricks tonight, he said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. We put what you saw on the record with Hendricks as a witness, the latch. The point of origin, the timeline. We documented, the way you'd document anything legal. Then tomorrow I go talk to Roy Garrett. She blinked. Garrett. Why? Because he's been in this territory 2 years. Because he's at Fletcher's Creek, which borders Hargett's north property. Because a man who works land near someone hears things. He paused. And because Garrett is the kind of man who crosses a street to say the hard, true thing. That's the kind of man I want on our side of this. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, you said our side. I did. You're a hired hand on a seasonal lease. She was not saying it to push him away. She was saying it the way she always said the true thing, carefully, and wanting to know what he would do with it. I'm aware of that. The lease ends in March. I know when it ends. The smoke drifted between them. Outside, one of the cattle made a low sound and went quiet. Caleb. Her voice was different now. Not the controlled, careful voice she used for problems. Something softer. Something she didn't use often. What are you actually saying? He looked at her directly. I'm saying that I have been telling myself for 9 years that the reason I don't stay anywhere is because I follow the work, he said. And I've been telling myself since I met you that I was here for the fence line. And I'm done telling myself things that aren't true. He held her gaze. I'm saying that I'd like to not leave in March. If you'd have that. If you'd want it. I don't have much to offer against what you've built here. Stop. Her voice was firm but not hard. Don't do that. What? Don't list your deficits. I've watched you work this land for 2 months. I know what you have to offer. She held his gaze. I just want to know if you mean it. If you say you'll stay, I need you to mean it. Because I cannot, she stopped. Took one breath. I cannot start to lean on someone and have them leave. I've buried one man I loved and it nearly took me with him. I won't survive building that again and watching it walk out the door. The barn was very quiet around them. I mean it, he said. I've never said anything to you that I didn't mean. She looked at him for a long, searching moment, the fullest look she had given him. The one that held nothing back, and then she nodded. Once slowly. All right, she said. Then let's go to Hendricks." They went out into the cold and closed the barn doors behind them. And the cattle were settling in the far pasture, and the smoke was already thinning in the winter air. And Hargett, wherever he was calculating on a woman alone, with a burned hay supply and a difficult winter ahead. He had made 2 mistakes in that calculation. He had not accounted for Roy Garrett at Fletcher's Creek, who knew things about the North property that no one had thought to ask. And he had not accounted for the fact that the woman he was trying to break had stopped being alone. And he had not accounted for the fact that the woman he was trying to break had stopped being alone, and neither, perhaps, had Caleb himself until that moment in the burned barn, when the word "our" out of his mouth without asking permission, and had sat in the smoke-heavy air between them, like something that had always been true, and had simply been waiting for him to say it out loud. Hendricks received them that evening without ceremony. He was a practical man in the way that men who have built things from difficult ground tend to be practical. He did not waste time on expressions of outrage. And he did not offer sympathy that hadn't been asked for. He looked at Abigail's account of the barn, the latch, the origin point, the timing, and he listened to Caleb's analysis of it. And then he sat back in his chair and drummed his fingers once on the table and said, "Write it down, both of you. Tonight, separately, exactly what you observed. Exactly what time, exactly what you concluded and why. Sign it and date it, and I'll countersign as witness." Abigail looked at him. "You believe us. I believe that Owen Hargett has wanted that parcel for 2 years and has no conscience about how he gets what he wants." Hendricks met her eyes directly. "And I believe that a hay fire that starts in the back corner of a latched barn during the exact window of time when the owner is in town reviewing legal documents is not an accident." He paused. "I should have been paying more attention to what he was doing on your southern boundary." "That's on me, Mrs. Mercer." "It's on him," Abigail said quietly. "Let's be accurate about that." Hendricks almost smiled. "Fair enough." They wrote the accounts at Hendricks's table separately, as he'd said, and Caleb watched Abigail write hers from across the room. Her hand moving steadily across the paper, every detail precise and unembellished. And he thought that she wrote the way she did everything, without waste and without fear, and with a clarity that most people spent their whole lives failing to achieve. Hendricks countersigned both and put them in his safe. "What's your next move?" Hendricks asked, looking at Caleb. "Garrett, Fletcher's Creek." Hendricks nodded slowly. "Roy Garrett, I know of him, solid man. He borders Hargett's North property. If Hargett's been doing this kind of thing before, Garrett may have seen something." Caleb paused. "And Garrett has no reason to protect Hargett." "None. Go tomorrow," Hendricks said early, and Caleb he stopped. Caleb waited. "You're a good hand. Best I've had on the South Lease in 6 years." Hendricks said it plainly. "Man to man. Whatever you decide about March, you've got a place here as long as you want it." The room was quiet for a moment. Abigail did not look up from folding her written account. But something in the set of her shoulders changed slightly, and Caleb understood that she had heard it and was giving him room to receive it on his own terms. "Thank you," Caleb said. They drove back to the Mercer cabin in the dark, and the night was clear now, stars hard and bright in the cold. And the road was quiet under the horses. She sat beside him on the bench the same way she always did. And the 3 inches of space between them felt different than it had a week ago, not larger, but more honest, like a space that was there by choice rather than by distance. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought about it. "Not of Hargett," she said. "Of what he might do to the cattle. The structures insured under the territorial agreement James set up. But the cattle," she stopped. "If he goes after the herd, I lose the operation. Not just this season. The whole thing. He won't touch the cattle." "How can you know that?" "Because cattle are traceable. Hay burns and there's no proof. Cattle go missing and there are questions that don't stop." He kept his eyes on the road. "Hargett is careful. Careful men don't take risks they can't control. He took the risk of the barn. The barn was a message. It was designed to frighten, not to destroy. The structure is still standing. If he wanted the barn gone, it would be gone." He paused. "What he wants is for you to feel alone and outgunned and decide that selling is easier than fighting." She was quiet for a moment. "It would be easier," she said. "I want to be honest about that. There are mornings," she stopped, seemed to decide something. There are mornings when I wake up, and the weight of it, all of it. The land, the cattle, the money, the men in town who are waiting for me to fail, it sits on my chest like something physical. And I lie there and I think about what it would feel like to just stop. To let it go. To go back east where my sister is, and have someone else make the decisions. He didn't say anything. He let her finish. And then I get up, she said. Because James didn't build this for me to give it to Owen Hargett. And because somewhere in me I know that if I leave, I'm not going back to something. I'm running from something. And I've made my peace with a lot of things in my life. But I don't think I could make my peace with that. He looked at her in the dark. You've never told anyone that, he said. The part about the mornings. No. She looked straight ahead. I haven't. Why tell me? She turned and looked at him then. And in the starlight her face was very clear. Because you told me the true thing on a burned-out road in town, she said. It seemed like the right exchange. He held her gaze for one long moment and then turned back to the road. And the horses moved through the dark, and neither of them spoke again until they reached the cabin. And what was said in that silence was said completely. He rode to Fletcher's Creek the next morning before full light. Roy Garrett was up, the kind of man who was always up before you arrived, who had coffee ready and no surprise on his face, who seemed to have been expecting the conversation even before it was requested. They sat at his table and Caleb laid it out: the barn, the hay, the water rights, the land office and Aldrich, the feed orders, all of it, in the order it had happened. Without editorializing, Garrett listened with his hands around his cup and his eyes on the table. When Caleb finished, Garrett said, "He used a man named Dills." Caleb went still. "For the barn. I don't know for certain about the barn. But Dills works for Hargett on the irregular jobs, the ones that don't get written down. He lives out past the North Cut, which is 3 miles from the Mercer south boundary." Garrett looked up. "Last night I heard a horse on the creek road around mid-morning. Didn't think anything of it at the time. Now I'm thinking. Would you write that down? What you heard?" "When yes." Garrett said it without hesitation. "I'll write it down. And there's something else." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "Hargett's water angle. The territorial filing on the South Creek. Is there anything on his north property that connects to that water access? Anything that would explain why he wants the Mercer parcel this specifically?" Garrett set his cup down. He was quiet for 10 full seconds, which was long enough that Caleb knew there was something. 3 years ago, Garrett said, Hargett tried to get a mining survey done on the north slope of his property. The slope that runs down toward the South Creek. He paused. The survey came back with something. I don't know what. But Hargett bought 2 adjacent parcels within 60 days of getting the results. And he's been moving south ever since. The cold that had lived in Caleb's stomach since the barn's visit deepened by a degree. A mineral survey. That's what the man who ran it told me. Afterward, over too much whiskey in Garrison's only saloon. He said Hargett had found something interesting under the North Ridge, and he needed the water access to make anything useful of it. Garrett met his eyes. If there's mineral extraction on the North Ridge that requires South Creek water, and the Mercer parcel controls South Creek access, then the Mercer land isn't worth what farmland is worth. It's worth what that mineral survey said it's worth. Caleb sat back. The full picture arranged itself in his mind, all of it. Every piece of it and the shape it made was larger and worse and more calculated than even Corcoran had understood. Hargett wasn't trying to consolidate grazing land. He was trying to unlock a mining operation, and Abigail Mercer was sitting on the key. He rode back to the Mercer cabin at a pace that made the horse work. And he came through the gate to find Abigail in the yard with a man he did not recognize, well dressed. Not a rancher, the particular carriage of a man who was accustomed to being received rather than arriving. He dismounted and came across the yard, and the man turned. And Abigail's face when she saw Caleb was controlled, but her eyes said, "I need you here right now, Mr. Whitaker." She kept her voice even. "This is Mr. Gerald Foss. He represents a land investment firm out of Cheyenne." Foss extended his hand. Caleb shook it once. "Whitaker." Foss had the smooth manner of a man who had trained himself to be liked. "Mrs. Mercer was just telling me about the operation here." Very impressive for the scale. He smiled at Abigail. "I was explaining to her that our firm has been retained by a private investor to assess parcels in this valley. We're prepared to make a very generous offer on the Mercer property, well above the assessed value. Caleb looked at Abigail. She was watching him. Who's the private investor? Caleb asked. Foss tilted his head. Our clients prefer. Who is it? The smoothness held, but the smile behind it recalculated. I'm not at liberty to. Is it Owen Hargett? A pause. Small but present. Our client roster is confidential. Right. Caleb looked at Abigail. He sent a front man, so his name isn't on the offer. Abigail turned to Foss. Her voice was perfectly pleasant and completely final. Mr. Foss, I appreciate you making the trip, but I am not interested in selling at any price. That position is not going to change today, or next week, or in the spring. If your client has retained you specifically for this parcel, you should advise them to redirect their investment. She paused. And you should know that any further pressure on this property, any kind, is being documented and witnessed and is one step away from the territorial court. You may want to include that in your report. Foss looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at her. I'll pass that along, he said. He left without further ceremony, and they watched him ride out. And when the sound of hooves faded, Abigail let out one long, controlled breath. He arrived 20 minutes ago, she said. Right after you left for Garrett's. The timing was deliberate. Hargett knew where you'd gone and wanted me alone. How did Hargett know I was going to Garrett's? She turned to him. I don't know, but he knew. That meant one of two things. Either Hargett had someone watching the roads, or someone in Hendrix's operation had said something they shouldn't have. Caleb filed both possibilities and moved past them because the more immediate thing was Garrett's information and what it changed. He told her everything. The mining survey, the North Ridge, the water access, what Hargett actually wanted the land for. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she walked to the fence and put both hands on the top rail and looked out over her land, the south field, the creek line, the ridge beyond, and he stood beside her and let her look. He found something under the ridge, she said, likely, and he needs my water to get to it. That's what it points to. She was quiet again. The wind moved through the field grass. James knew about the minerals, she said. Caleb turned to look at her. Her hands were still on the fence rail, and her knuckles were white, and her voice was very steady. He told me the last time he came home that the land was worth more than anyone knew. That the South Creek wasn't just water, it was the kind of water that made other things possible. She paused. I thought he was talking about the cattle, about irrigation. Her jaw tightened. He knew, and Hargett knew that he knew, which is why the offers started, and why they accelerated after he died. Yes. She turned from the fence. Her eyes were very clear and very hard, in the particular way of a woman who has moved through grief and come out on the other side of it, somewhere that looks like resolve. He's been counting on me not knowing what James knew. He's been counting on me being a grieving widow who just wants the trouble to stop. He miscalculated, he did. She looked at Caleb. But this changes things. If there are mineral rights tied to the water access, they need to be explicitly included in the water rights documentation or a separate filing. If I don't establish that explicitly, even if I hold the land, someone could argue the mineral rights separately. He looked at her. You know land law. James taught me. He was meticulous about it. I used to tease him about it, all those territorial filings and boundary surveys. She pressed her lips together. He knew. He was building the case before anything happened to him. Then we need a lawyer. There's one in Laramie. Not Garrison Laramie. He handled the original Mercer filing when James first settled the parcel. His name is Carver. She had already thought this through. He could see it in her face. The plan forming as she spoke. If we can get documentation of the mineral survey, any record of it, and connect it to the water rights filing, we can establish the full scope of what this land contains before Hargett can file any competing claim. Garrett's mining surveyor. He talked once. He might talk again. Could you find him? Garrett knows where he drinks. She almost smiled. Of course he does. The plan that assembled itself over the next 2 hours was not comfortable, and it was not simple. And it had more moving pieces than Caleb liked, but it was real. And it was theirs, and every piece of it had been built from something they knew rather than something they assumed. Garrett would provide a written account of what the surveyor had told him. The surveyor, his name was Pell. A man currently working a lease near Rawlins would need to be approached directly. Carver in Laramie would need to see the original water rights documentation and any mineral survey records they could obtain before Harkett's front company could file a competing claim. Hendricks's witness statements about the barn would go to the same file. It was the kind of case that won when it was airtight and lost when it had a single gap. And the gap that worried Caleb most was Pell. He talked to Garrett under whiskey, Caleb said. That's different from testifying, I know. Abigail folded her hands on the table. He may not want to cross Hargett, no. He may not. Can you convince him? Caleb thought about it. Not with money. I don't have enough to compete with what Hargett would pay him to stay quiet. He paused. But Pell is a surveyor. He's a man who cares about what the land actually is. If I go to him and I tell him what Hargett has been doing the barn, the feed orders, the front company, there's a chance that the thing that makes him talk isn't money. It's the fact that Hargett has been using his work to harm someone. You think he has a conscience. I think most people do. The question is whether it's buried too deep to be useful. She looked at him. When are you going? Tomorrow morning. I'll be back by nightfall. And if he says no? He met her eyes. Then we build the case without him, and we make what we have as strong as it can be. It's not nothing, Abigail. It's Garrett's testimony and the barn documentation and the front company visit and the water rights filing and whatever Carver can make of it. He paused. It's not nothing, she nodded. And then because she was who she was, she said, come back. Just that. Not be careful and not good luck and not the layered, qualified thing a person says when they're afraid to say the simple thing. Just come back. The way you say it when you mean everything underneath it and you trust the other person to understand. I'll come back, he said. He rode to Rawlins the next morning. He found Pell at the third place. He looked a boarding house with a small table in the common room. A man in his 50s with a surveyor's careful hands and the eyes of someone who spent most of his life looking at things other people walked past without seeing. Caleb sat down across from him without being invited. Pell looked at him. Don't know you. No, but you know Roy Garrett. Something shifted in Pell's face. I'm working for Abigail Mercer, Caleb said. The south parcel above the creek road outside Garrison. The parcel that Owen Hargett has been trying to take from her since her husband died, including burning her barn while she was in town reviewing legal documents. He kept his voice level, and he kept his eyes on Pell's face. I know you surveyed the North Ridge on Hargett's property 3 years ago. I know what you found because you told Roy Garrett what you found. And I know that Hargett has been using that survey, your professional work, to justify everything he's done to this woman and her land. Pell was very still. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do, Caleb said. But I want you to know what your work has been used for. And I want you to decide whether that sits right with you. A long silence. The common room of the boarding house moved around them, other men talking. A woman clearing plates from the far table, the ordinary sounds of a place that had nothing to do with any of this. Pell looked down at his hands, the careful hands that had measured and recorded and submitted the survey that had started all of this. What do you need? He said finally. A written account of what the survey found. What it means for the water access. Signed, dated, notarized if you can manage it. Caleb paused. I need it to be true and I need it to be yours. That's all. Another silence. Hargett will know I talked. Yes. That's a problem for me. I know it is. I won't lie to you about that. Caleb held his gaze. But Hargett is going to lose this. If you're on the right side of it when it's over, that matters more than whether he's angry about it. Pell looked at him for a long moment. Something worked its way through his expression, the slow movement of a man's conscience, winning an argument his caution was trying to hold. I'll write it, Pell said. Give me until evening. Caleb rode back to the Mercer cabin with Pell's written account folded inside his coat. And the gate was still standing, and the smoke from the chimney was the right color, and the cattle were in the near pasture, and she was in the yard when he came through. And she looked at his face and read it before he said a word. He gave you something. He gave us everything we needed. He dismounted and handed her the reins, and she took them because her hands needed something to do right now. It's enough for Carver. It's enough for the territorial court. and it directly connects the mineral survey to the water access in language that a land lawyer can use. She stood there holding the reins with Pell's account in his hand between them, and her eyes were very bright, the particular brightness of someone who has been holding something enormous for a long time and has just felt the first real evidence that they do not have to hold it alone. Caleb. Her voice was not steady. It was the first time it had not been steady. In all of it, in the barn, and on the street, and at Hendrix's table, and facing down the front man from Cheyenne. "I know," he said. He didn't say it to cut her off. He said it because he did know all of it. The weight of what she'd been carrying, and the cost of what it had taken to carry it this far, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been right and careful and disciplined for months without anyone to confirm that the right thing and the hard thing were worth being the same thing. She took one breath. Then she set her jaw and straightened, and she was steady again. "Laramie," she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. They went inside. The fire in the stove was low, and she built it up, and he put the horses in the barn, and when he came back in, she had food on the table, not the elaborate meal a person makes when they're trying to impress, but the real meal, the honest one. The kind you make when you are feeding someone you expect to be there tomorrow and the day after, and they sat across from each other and ate and talked through what Carver would need and what the territorial court timeline would look like and what Hargett would do when he realized the filing was coming. And at some point the conversation moved away from the plan entirely and became something else, just two people at a table in Wyoming in winter, talking about nothing consequential, about Thomas and James and what it was like to lose someone so completely that the world had a different shape afterward, and how a person learned to live in the new shape, and whether the new shape ever stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like something you could call your own. "Does it?" he asked. "For you, does it stop feeling like loss?" She thought about it for a long time. "It changes," she said. "It doesn't go away. But it changes from something that takes up all the room to something that lives alongside everything else. Like a piece of furniture that you rearrange until it fits." She paused. "And then one day you realize you haven't thought about moving it in a while. And that doesn't mean you love them less. It means you've made room for other things too." He looked at her across the table. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's the part I've been having trouble with. Making room. Making room." She held his gaze. "I know. I could tell the first week you were here that you were a man who'd been living in a very small space inside himself for a long time." Her voice was gentle and absolutely direct. "But you're here, and that's not nothing. You came back when I asked you to. You went to Garrett and Pell and Hendrix, and you built something real out of this." She paused. "You made room, Caleb. You just didn't notice yet." The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves. He looked at the table and then at her, and he thought about 9 years of riding and not stopping. And he thought about a prayer he was never supposed to hear. And he thought about what it felt like to have someone see you, really see you. Not the version you showed the world, but the actual you. The one that had been sitting in the dark for a long time and not leave. "I'm not going to leave," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the filing, whatever Hargett does next, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I believe you," she said, and the simplicity of it, no conditions, no qualifications, no careful hedge against being wrong, was the most significant thing anyone had said to him in 9 years. And the simplicity of it, no conditions, no qualifications, no careful hedge against being wrong, was the most significant thing anyone had said to him in 9 years. And he carried it with him into the next morning, the way a man carries something he intends to be worthy of. They rode to Laramie 2 days later. Carver was exactly what Caleb had hoped for, a man in his 60s who had practiced land law in Wyoming territory since before the railroad, who wore his skepticism on the outside where you could see it and respect it, and who read every document they placed in front of him without speaking for 22 minutes straight, while Abigail and Caleb sat across from his desk and waited. When he looked up, he looked at Abigail first. "Your husband was meticulous." He was. "This water rights filing is one of the cleanest I've seen at the territorial level. The boundary description is specific enough that any challenge would require a full court proceeding, not an administrative review." He tapped the page. "Hargett can't go around this. He'd have to go through it. And the mineral connection? Caleb asked. Carver picked up Pell's account and read it again, and not the whole thing, but the middle section, the part where Pell described what the survey had found on the North Ridge and what water access would be required to develop it. He set it down. If Pell will stand by this in court, this changes the land value classification of the Mercer parcel significantly. He looked at Abigail. It also means that any attempt by Hargett to acquire this land without your consent through administrative pressure, fraudulent survey filings, or any other mechanism crosses from business competition into something that the territorial court takes considerably more seriously. What does that mean practically? Abigail asked. It means I can file an injunction against any competing claim before one is made. It means Hargett cannot file anything against this parcel without triggering an automatic review of his conduct toward your property. Carver leaned forward. And it means that the documented barn fire, with witness statements, becomes evidence in a pattern of coercion rather than an isolated incident. He paused. Mrs. Mercer, if you'll allow me to file this week, I can have the injunction in place before Hargett's people know it's coming. Abigail looked at Caleb. He said nothing. He had brought her here. The decision was hers. She turned back to Carver. File it. Carver set his pen down. Hargett will know the moment this is filed. He will be angry. Real anger, not the managed kind he's been showing you. You should be prepared for that. I've been prepared for that since October, Abigail said. Carver almost smiled. Good. He picked up his pen. Then let's get to work. They left Carver's office in the early afternoon and walked out into the cold Laramie Street. And Abigail stopped on the sidewalk and stood very still for a moment, with her face turned slightly away. And Caleb stood beside her and waited. James would have liked you, she said. It came out quietly, not weighted with anything heavy. Just offered. He looked at her profile. Why? Because you think before you act. But you don't hesitate when it matters. She turned to face him. He was like that. He used to say that a slow decision made well beats a fast decision made badly every time. She paused. You would have argued about cattle with him. I probably would have. He would have enjoyed it. She looked down the street. He enjoyed people who didn't pretend to agree with him when they didn't. He thought about James Mercer, a man he had never met, who had built a parcel and filed meticulous legal documents, and loved this woman and taught her everything about the land she stood on, and he felt something that was not jealousy and not grief, but a kind of respect, the particular respect you have for someone you understand without having known. He built something worth keeping, Caleb said. Yes. Her voice was steady. And so will we, she said it simply, the way she said most things. And it landed in him, the way simple things do, when they carry the full weight of everything leading up to them, without drama, without ceremony, just as a fact that had decided to be true. They drove back to the Mercer parcel that evening, and the next morning Caleb was up before her, feeding the cattle, checking the fence line that he had come to know, as well as his own name. And when she came out with 2 cups of coffee, he was at the near gate, and she handed one across without ceremony, and they stood in the cold morning and drank them, and the sun came up hard and clear over the ridge, and it lit the South Creek line gold. It's beautiful land, he said. I know. She looked at it the way she always looked at it, not possessively, but with the particular love of someone who has earned the right to be in a place. James used to say that some land chooses its people as much as people choose their land. He looked at the ridge. The north slope of Hargett's property was just visible above the tree line. A dark rise against the pale sky, holding whatever was under it that had set all of this in motion. Do you think he knew it would come to this? Caleb asked. James, when he filed all of it so carefully. She was quiet for a moment. I think he knew something might come, she said. He was a man who thought ahead. He built things to last. She paused. I used to think he was being overly cautious. Now I think he was being loving, in the way that some people love, by building things that protect the people they leave behind. The wind moved through the field grass. He left you well armed, Caleb said. He left me the tools. You helped me pick them up. She looked at him sideways. There's a difference. He looked back at her. The morning light was on her face, and she was not a woman who required anything from light. She looked the same as she always looked, which was honest and direct and real, in a way that most people spent their whole lives trying to approximate. He thought about the prayer. The first one. The one he had heard through a thin wall on a frozen Wyoming night when he was supposed to be asleep and wasn't. And she was kneeling beside a man she barely knew and asking God to remind him that losing someone didn't mean he was meant to carry it alone. He had not told her that he loved her. He had said everything around it, "I'm not leaving. It's you specifically. I want to not leave in March," all the real things that pointed toward it. But not the word itself, because the word itself was the one that felt most irreversible, most final, most like the closing of a door behind him on every year of distance he had put between himself and the possibility of being destroyed by loss again. He was standing at that door right now. He could feel the frame of it. "Abigail." She looked at him. "I love you." He sat straight. No approach, no construction around it. "I want you to know that. Not as a prelude to anything, just as the true thing. I love you." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes went very bright, the particular brightness that was not tears, but was the thing that happened just before a person decided whether to allow the tears or not. She decided not, which was very much like her. "I know," she said. "You know, I've known for a while." She turned back to the creek line. "I was waiting for you to know it too." He laughed, a short, real sound, surprised out of him, the kind of laugh that comes from being caught out by someone who sees you more clearly than you see yourself. "How long?" he asked. "Since you split 3 weeks of firewood when you only needed to split one." She was smiling now, small and private and completely genuine. A man doesn't split 3 weeks of firewood for a woman he's keeping his distance from. He shook his head slowly. "I love you too," she said, quiet, direct, hers, in case you needed to hear it in those words. "I did," he said. "I needed to hear it exactly like that." The morning held them for a moment, easy and warm in the cold air, and then she went in to start the stove, and he went back to the fence line because the work was real, and the land was real, and the life they were building toward was real. And there was no better way to honor any of it than by doing the thing in front of you with everything you had. Carver filed the injunction on a Thursday. By Friday morning, all of Garrison knew. Caleb was at the Mercer cabin when Hendricks rode in fast from the North Road. And the look on Hendricks's face told him everything before a word was spoken. "Hargit's at the land office," Hendricks said, dismounting. "He's been there 2 hours. Aldrich won't let him file anything. The injunction covers the parcel completely. But Hargit is not taking it calmly." How not calmly? He told Aldrich that the filing was fraudulent, that Pell's account was coerced. Hendricks looked at Abigail, who had come out of the cabin. He's saying Caleb threatened Pell to get the testimony. The coldness was immediate. Caleb felt it go through him, not fear, but the particular rage of a man being accused of the exact opposite of what he had done. Abigail's face was very still. "Threatened him," she said flatly. "That's what Hargit is saying. He's got Aldrich writing something up, I don't know what. Some kind of counter-affidavit, and he sent someone to Rollins to find Pell." Hendricks looked at Caleb. "If Pell recount," Caleb said, "I did not threaten him. I sat across a table from him, and I told him the truth about what his survey had been used for. He made his own decision, I believe you." Hendricks met his eyes. "But Hargit has 2 men on the town council and Aldrich in his pocket. If he can create enough noise around the testimony before Carver can get it into the court record." "How long does Carver need?" Abigail asked. "I don't know. He filed Thursday. The court review." "I'm going to Rollins." Caleb was already moving toward the barn. Abigail caught his arm, not to stop him just for 1 second, to make him look at her. "Don't go alone," she said. "Garrett. I'll get Garrett on the way." She held his gaze. "Come back," she said again, the same 2 words as before, carrying everything they always carried. "I'll come back." He rode to Fletcher's Creek in 40 minutes, and Garrett was in his yard, and Caleb didn't dismount. Hargit sent someone to Pell to get him to recant. "I need to get to Rollins first." Garrett had his coat on in 90 seconds. They rode hard. The road to Rollins was flat for the first half and rough for the second. And they didn't talk much because the horses needed their breath. And Caleb had time to think about what Hargit's man would offer Pell money. Certainly, and the implicit threat of what happened to people who crossed Hargit, which had so far included a burned barn and a front company and a counter-affidavit built on a lie. He thought about what he had to offer against that. The truth, Garrett's testimony, and the fact that Pell had looked at his own hands and made a decision that cost him something. And men who made that kind of decision rarely unmade it the same day. They arrived in Rawlins in early afternoon. Pell was at the boarding house. So was another man younger, trail dusty, the particular look of someone who had ridden fast from somewhere and hadn't expected to find company. Hargot's man. He was standing at Pell's table when Caleb walked through the door. And he turned and assessed Caleb and Garrett in the same smooth movement and stood up slowly. "Whitaker," he said. Caleb didn't know his name. He didn't need it. He looked at Pell. Pell was pale. "Whatever he offered you," Caleb said. Keeping his voice level, "I want you to hear one thing before you decide. Carver has already filed. The injunction is in place. The territorial court has the documentation including your account. If you recant now, you will be explaining to a territorial court why you're signed. Notarized professional account changed 24 hours after it was submitted." He paused. "That is a conversation about your professional license, not just your conscience." Hargot's man took a step forward. Garrett moved not fast, not aggressive, just into a position that required the man to go through him to go anywhere. "I'd stay put," Garrett said pleasantly. Hargot's man looked at Garrett, then at Caleb, then back at Pell. "Hargot's not going to forget this," he said. "No," Caleb agreed, "he won't. But Hargot is going to lose. And the question Mr. Pell needs to answer is whether he wants to be remembered as the man who told the truth, or the man who took money to lie about his own professional work." He held Pell's eyes. "You know what you found on that ridge. You know what it's worth. And you know that the woman who owns the water access has had her barn burned and her feed orders shorted and a front company sent to her door while she's been doing nothing more than running her land legally and well. You wrote down the truth once. I'm asking you to keep it." Pell looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Hargot's man. "I've got nothing to say to you," Pell said. "Tell Hargot I stand by my account." The man left. Caleb let out a breath he had been holding since Rawlins. Garrett put a hand briefly on Pell's shoulder. "Good man." Pell looked at his hands again, those careful surveyor's hands, and nodded once. The nod of someone who has made peace with a costly decision and is not going to spend more time on it than it deserves. "Don't let her lose that land," Pell said. "We won't," Caleb said. They rode back faster than they'd come. The territorial court review took 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which Hargot filed 2 counter documents that Carver dismantled methodically. In which Aldrich was quietly replaced as land office clerk when the county supervisor, who had finally been briefed on the full pattern of events by Hendricks, in a meeting that Caleb was told lasted 2 hours and involved language that was not commonly heard in business settings, made a formal inquiry into the office's handling of the Mercer documentation. 3 weeks in which Owen Hargot came to the Mercer gate exactly once. Caleb was there when he came. Hargot looked older than he had on that first visit in the yard. The smooth calculation was still present, but it was working harder. And the thing underneath it, the frustration of a man who had been very patient for a very long time and had seen that patience fail, was closer to the surface. He did not get off his horse. "Whitaker," he said. He didn't look at Abigail, who was standing in the yard. "Hargot, I want to speak with Mrs. Mercer. She's listening." Caleb stood between Hargot and Abigail. Not aggressively, just present in the way that was enough. Hargot looked at Abigail over Caleb's shoulder. "I'll increase the offer. Significantly. Whatever Carver has filed, I can make it worth more to you to settle than to fight." Abigail to stand beside Caleb. Not behind him, beside him, Mr. Hargot. Her voice was the one she used when the answer was final. "I want you to hear me clearly. This land is not for sale. It was not for sale when you sent Foss, or when you shorted my feed, or when you burned my hay. It was not for sale when James was alive, and it is not for sale now." She met his eyes without flinching. "You have spent 2 years trying to make me feel alone enough to give up. I want you to know that you failed, and I want you to know that every document we have filed reflects exactly what you did and how you did it. And it is in the territorial court record permanently, which means it is also part of your permanent record." She paused. "I don't wish you harm, Mr. Hargot, but I am done being managed by you. Good day." She turned and walked back into the cabin. Hargot looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him and said nothing, which said everything. Hargett turned his horse and left. And that was the last time Owen Hargett came to the Mercer gate. The territorial court ruled in the 4th week. The water rights stood. The mineral access was explicitly tied to the water rights documentation in a legal classification that meant any future mining claim on the North Ridge by Hargett or anyone else would require Mercer authorization. Pell's account was entered into the record. The barn fire was noted as part of a documented pattern of coercion. Aldrich was the subject of a separate inquiry. Hargett filed no further documents. Carver sent the ruling by rider, and Caleb was in the barn when Abigail came in with the letter, and he looked at her face and knew before she read a word of it. She read it anyway, out loud, all of it, standing in the barn in the cold, her voice steady until the last paragraph and then not quite. And she stopped and pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling and then at him. "We won," she said. "You won," he said. "I just helped carry things." She shook her head. "Don't do that. Don't make yourself smaller than you are. You went to Corcoran and Garrett and Pell and Hendricks and Laramie and Rollins. You were there every time it mattered." Her voice was firm. "This is ours." He held her gaze. "We won," he said. She crossed the barn and she put her arms around him and held on with the particular grip of someone releasing something that has been held very tightly for a very long time. And he held her back, his arms around her, her face against his shoulder. The cold air and the smell of hay and horses around them, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. He felt her breathe, just that, the simple, steady fact of her breathing. He thought about 9 years of not being this close to another person's life. 9 years of moving and keeping distance and telling himself it was protection when it was only habit. Only fear wearing the costume of wisdom. He pressed his face into her hair. "I'm not going anywhere," he said into the quiet. "I know." Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "I stopped worrying about that a while ago." "When?" She pulled back enough to look at him. Her eyes were bright and real and entirely certain. "When I realized that a man who splits 3 weeks of firewood and rides to Rollins in a day and stands between a woman and her problems without being asked, that man is not leaving." She studied his face. "He's already home. He just doesn't always know it yet." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out the thing he had been carrying there for 11 days. Since the morning after the Laramie trip, when he had stopped in a Laramie shop and stood in front of a glass case for 10 minutes and then done the thing without arguing with himself about it. Because he had been done arguing with himself for a while now, and it was time to simply act. It was a ring, plain gold band, no ornamentation, the kind a man buys when he wants the thing itself to speak rather than anything decorating it. He held it in his palm between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. He did not get on one knee. He was not sure she would want him to. She was not a woman who needed ceremony. And the barn was not a church. And they had already said everything leading to this moment in a burned haystack in a Laramie office, and on a cold street in Garrison, and at a table with good coffee, and in 2 words on a porch step that had meant everything. "I want to stay," he said. "Not just through the winter. Not on a seasonal lease. I want to stay on this land and help you build what James started and what you've kept going and what I want to be part of for the rest of my life." He held her gaze. "I know this is fast by most people's measure. I know I came through your door with a cut hand and didn't speak more than 20 words the first week. I know I'm not Caleb." Her voice was gentle and firm. "Stop listing your deficits." "Right," he stopped. Took a breath. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring in his palm. She looked at his face. She reached out and took the ring from his hand and looked at it closely, turned it in the light. The practical assessment of a woman who examines things, and then she looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "obviously yes." He almost laughed. "Obviously. I prayed for you before I even knew your name properly," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger and looking at it. "I think that constitutes a fairly clear indication of direction." "That is," he said, "the least romantic and most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me." She looked up at him and smiled fully. Not the small private smile he had seen at the corners of her mouth in the careful weeks, but the real one, the one that changed her whole face, and he understood in that moment that this was what it looked like when Abigail Mercer stopped being careful with something. He kissed her. Not tentatively and not briefly, and not with any of the reservation that had lived in every interaction since the night of the storm, just directly and truly. The way a man kisses a woman when he has been working up to it for months and has finally stopped finding reasons to wait. She kissed him back the same way. When they pulled apart, she kept her hands on his coat and looked at him with the clear-eyed, honest look that was entirely hers. James used to say, she said softly, that the land would always tell you what it needed if you were willing to listen. She paused. I think people are like that too. You just have to be still enough to hear them. He thought about the night of the storm. The prayer through a thin wall. The way those words had moved through him in the dark and settled somewhere he hadn't let anything settle in 9 years. I heard you, he said. That night. I wasn't asleep. She looked at him. Not surprised, she had known, of course, since the morning when he told her he slept light. But hearing him say it directly, fully, was different. I know, she said quietly. I think I knew the next morning when I looked at you. You had the look of a man who had heard something he wasn't ready for. She paused. I kept praying anyway. I'm glad you did, so am I. The winter light was moving through the barn boards. Late afternoon gold, and outside the cattle were settling in the near pasture, and the South Creek was running under its ice skin, and the ridge beyond the tree line held its secret quietly beneath the snow. Carver's ruling was in her hand. The ring was on her finger. The lease would end in March, and he would not leave when it did. Later, weeks later, when the first thaw came, and the creek began to run freely, and the south field showed the first pale green, under the dead grass she would kneel beside the bed in the back room one evening, the way she always did. The room that had been his and was now theirs, and she would pray the way she always prayed. The way that had no walls and no audience, and he would be awake. The way he was always awake because he slept light. And he would hear her. She would pray for him. She always prayed for him. But now the prayer had changed, not in its nature, not in its sincerity, but in its content, and what she asked for was not that he be reminded he didn't have to be alone. She asked for something quieter, something that spoke of a man who had already crossed from one life into another and was learning, slowly with her help and his own hard-won willingness, what it meant to stay. He would lie very still and listen. And for the first time in 9 years, he would close his eyes when the prayer was finished and be asleep before it fully faded, because that was what it felt like when a man had finally, completely come home. Some people enter your life loudly. They announce themselves. They fill every room. And then there are the ones who arrive quietly through a storm door. With a wound they didn't ask you to fix and stay so completely that eventually you cannot remember what the house felt like before them. Abigail Mercer had prayed for a man she barely knew, and the prayer had found him. Caleb Whitaker had heard a prayer that was not meant for him, and had spent the rest of his life trying to become worthy of it. And the land, the south parcel above the creek road, with its water rights and its winter cattle, and its burned hay now replaced, and its fence line standing straight, held them both, as land does when it has finally found its people.